Okay, today we're talking about Puritan Society. So, to understand with English colonization, we kind of split the two up. There are technically two groups that were English and colonized the Americas. The first we looked at, we titled Early English Colonization, and that generally is the Chesapeake region. And then the one that we're looking at today with Puritan Society was New England, and it was the Puritans. They were both English, though, but they're very, very different in pretty much every way possible. And so you definitely don't want to combine them as and try to generalize the two together in some way. It just doesn't work. And so the first group that went to Jamestown in the Chesapeake region, they tend to get classified as the English colonization. And then Puritans, although they're English, get their own title as Puritans, um, in part because of how much they broke from England in many ways. But I think it is important to note that they were English as well, but definitely identified themselves more as Puritan first, over English. I mean, to the point that they were wanting to leave England, not for wealth like the Chesapeake, but for other reasons. So, before we even get started in diving into their structure of society and who they were and what they believed, we need to know and kind of look at who were the Puritans and look at their background and how that shaped their society. So the Puritans emerged really because of the Protestant Reformation. So you have the Protestant Reformation was an important period in time which challenged the Catholic Church. And prior to the Protestant Reformation, you only had the Catholic Church. It was the only Christian church available. Didn't mean that there weren't schisms within the Catholic Church and conflicts and arguments over location and popes and things like that. But ultimately, that was the Christian church. And that was what the Catholic Church had intended it to be, was meant to be universal. It was the universal Christian church. So how does that change? Well, it comes about because of the Protestant Reformation with a person called Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, he was a monk. His father wanted him to be a lawyer, and he decided to become a monk instead, probably much to the disappointment of his family. And he was in the Catholic Church because that was the only church available. The thing about the Catholic Church at this time is, as much as there are corruption issues and problems with the Catholic Church today, it was so much more corrupt back then and had so many problems because it was unchecked. It had an enormous amount of power, and the Pope wielded political and religious power like none other. And there were a lot of issues with cardinals and bishops and even the Pope having children, having families. But more than even that, controlling the political realm. You actually have a Pope that portrayed himself fully in knight armor as a warrior. And then you had at the local level. So how the church worked, if we kind of break that up for just a second, right? You have the main church with the Pope, right? And so that is your main church. Okay, but then pretty much you have the towns and cities, and they all have their own churches, and with that they have their priests and friars and monks and things like that, and they have to raise money for several things, right? And the money comes for building projects, because during that period, you have essentially towns competed for who had the largest church. And so one town would build a church, and then the town over would build a slightly bigger church. So then they'd raise more funds to add on to the church to make their church bigger than the other town. And it was this kind of competition. Of course, there were other issues where the people made pilgrimages to churches that had relics. So the relics played a role in it, and those were sometimes bought if they couldn't be obtained in other ways. And then money also had to go to the Pope, right? The main church and the main Catholic Church. So you had a variety of things that they were raising funds for. And this led to corruption, ultimately, because what you have is that the local religious leaders would use the money collected to finance themselves. So use money for themselves. Okay, and they did this in a variety of ways of raising money. The most common one was indulgences. And what you would do is that they would, people would come to the church, and they would say, if you pay this amount of money and go up on your knees for, this many steps, then you're absolved of whatever, or you can get your father out of purgatory. And so they sold these indulgences. Indulgences weren't originally meant to be sold that way. And that, like I said, it was a domino effect of a variety of things that led to that type of corruption. And notwithstanding, Martin Luther said he witnessed local friars that were drunkards, that were having sex with prostitutes. And so he saw all this corruption in the church. And so what he wanted initially was reform. He actually was not looking to break from the church. He wanted to reform this corruption. This here, we'll put 3, right? Bad priests and friars, just to kind of cover those different examples I gave. He wanted reform from that. He wanted them to change. He said they're hypocrites. He said the church was not supposed to function this way. It's taking advantage of people. And so he wrote his academic paper with 95 Theses, which were a list of grievances essentially for where the Catholic Church had failed and what reform should take place. Not super surprisingly, the Catholic Church didn't take that so well, and they wanted him put on trial, and they wanted him to recant publicly. He went to trial, and he refused to recant, and then they wanted him excommunicated, potentially executed, which would also suggest the level of corruption that the church is executing people. But so this is what causes the break, right? So it goes from reform to full-on break from the Catholic Church. And from the Protestant Reformation, then, and that break, you get new Christian denominations. And for the first time, you have different branches of the Christian church. And you're going to have, so Martin Luther, Lutheranism was one of them. And he essentially set up his belief system and church based on removing the things that he saw as corruptive within the Catholic Church. And then John Calvin is another one. There was a few others, but these were 2 big name ones. I mean, really, all of the denominations of Christianity today within the Christian Church, you can trace back to the Protestant Reformation. So it opened up a massive deluge of options for different religious beliefs. Even the Church of England was a break because of being able to utilize the Protestant Reformation in order for King Henry VIII to break from the Catholic Church. He didn't do it for religious reasons. He did it so he could get divorced. But nonetheless, that ability to do so, or even that thought to do so, came from the Protestant Reformation. And it certainly did force the Catholic Church to look at itself and look at reform. And you do see also a weakening position within the church that eventually will lead to other reforms and a weakening of power, which ultimately is beneficial because a lot of that corruption came through the absolute power and control that the Catholic Church had. So John Calvin was also connected to the Protestant faith, but very different from Martin Luther in some ways. In other ways, he kept some of the same principles. I'm not going to go into all of the details of Calvinism, but I do want to point out a couple that are going to come into the Puritan Society. So the first would be predestination. And predestination is the belief that it has already been determined whether or not you're saved. So technically, it doesn't matter what you do. You could be a mass murderer, and it has already been predetermined if you're saved or not. Now, the way that they address that, because of course, then why have a religion? What is there any rules to the religion if one of the fundamental tenets of your religion is that if it doesn't matter what I do in this life, I was determined before I was born whether I would be saved or not. So it really doesn't matter how I act or behave because it doesn't change anything about my position for going to heaven. And so the way around that was to suggest that how people acted and the way that you presented yourself and your actions and behaviors were an indicator of whether you were saved or not. There's no guarantee, and they always were clear to address that we can't know for sure, but you don't look like someone who'd be saved. That's kind of the idea behind it, which also then just makes it super judgy, because then you go around being like, saved, not saved, saved. The Puritans are actually going to be super judgy, so I suppose that fits. And then the next was the change for women, which was actually really important. And that was changing up the ideal of what the ideal role of women was supposed to be. In the Catholic Church, you had really two models for women. One was an ideal, and then one was a negative. The ideal was the Virgin Mary. So the nuns that ended up being created, kind of the counterpart to the monks, right? The nuns were kind of like that ideal in practice, as best as it could be. And then the negative image was Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. So you have either women as prostitutes or women as virgins. There's no in between. And the reality is that the majority of women didn't fit on either side of that spectrum. And so you had an almost unobtainable ideal or a very negative image of women. And I mean, you could get into that. That developed over time. The Catholic Church the Christian belief was very inclusive of women as it was forming. When it got formed into the Catholic Church, then these more unrealistic ideals or negative views were solidified at that point. So for Calvinism, he changed it to the ideal woman was the good wife. And this became a title that they addressed people as, good wife this, good wife. Instead of Mrs., it was good wife. And so the ideal within the good wife was to be married and have children. And the argument for this was that women were sexual beings, and it's interesting because that's going to change too, but his argument was women at this time were seen as the more sexual beings than men. So both people were sexual beings, but women were more so. And that doesn't change till around the Revolutionary War in the United States. Around the Revolutionary War period, we'll talk about Republican motherhood. And you see a shift then to women being shifted to almost asexual, right? They are not sexual. Men are the sexual deviants. But, and this will play a role, women being sexual deviants, if you will, in the Salem witch trials as well. So the idea was really that since women were so sexual in nature, that it was better to get married and have kids than to live in sin, because they were unlikely to be able to control themselves. Only a select few could obtain virgin status and be successful at it. Therefore, the focus should be on being a good wife. Why this is important is because most women, that was their role. They were married and they had children. So by idealizing a role that women could actually obtain, it actually was a positive image for women. Now, we'll see a lot of other things that aren't necessarily the case in Puritan society, but this was one of them that was a positive. And then lastly, what was like a godly society. So the idea that you had to create a society that monitored and managed people, because Calvin believed that people were kind of inherently bad and evil, and so you had to force people to be good, and the only way you could force people to good is to retreat from corrupt secular society and form your own community, which then you could establish the rules, religious rules and structure to make people be good. So there's other things with John Calvin, okay? So that's not the entirety of Calvinism, but these three things are what become the Puritans take with them. So the Puritans then were, well, here we'll do them as numbered. We'll do it as B. The Puritans were the English version of Calvinism. That's really it. John Calvin was not from England, and the Puritans were essentially the English version of Calvinism. So that's the practice. If you understand Calvinism and John Calvin, you understand the Puritans mostly. They do adapt and evolve in some differences, but they take these three components: predestination, the view of women, and this godly society, and they're going to keep those as kind of core tenets, if you will. So the background of what happens then is that they felt that England was not religious enough. They constantly complained about England, that they drank too much, that they partied too much, that they were corrupt. They weren't particularly liked in England, and it's not surprising considering if you're constantly berating English culture and peoples while they're English themselves, by the way, and saying you guys suck. when they decide they want to leave, everyone's like, oh God, please do. There was very little resistance to them taking off. Now, I want to be clear, not all Puritans left. You're going to have two different groups that do so. And we'll look at that in a minute. So that was their thing, as they said that England was not religious enough, and so that they wanted to create or find a place where that wouldn't be an issue. And they go first to Europe. And of course, the reason that they were taken in Europe was because of more liberal views. So it's not surprising after time went on that they didn't like that their kids were being influenced by this this outside society. And so they looked for somewhere else. So then they decided to move to, they looked to the Americas, specifically New England, and the goal being, right, to form their own society, their own godly society. This is key with this as well, is that we'll put it under here, they were looking for their religious freedom, not everyone else's. And in fact, they were very intolerant. So one of the misconceptions that you hear is like early colonization or the founding people. I mean, sometimes it gets tacked to the founding fathers, but other times people are trying to talk about the early settlers to the Americas were looking for religious freedom. And it's like, well, for themselves. not for anyone else. In fact, they exiled people all the time for not following the rules of their religious beliefs. Anne Hutchinson and Roger were probably the most famous ones that were exiled, but there's more than that, and those are in your book. We're gonna look at Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson is in Voices of Freedom first, and then Roger Williams is second, and they're the most two famous dissidents, if you will. But there were plenty of people that got exiled, and you got exiled when you challenged or the system or their beliefs. So let's say moved for their religious freedom, but not for all religious freedom. All right, so I just want to make sure that was clear. Is like they were definitely super intolerant. So there was no, we want religious freedom for everyone. No, we want religious freedom for us to set up our own society that creates that religious structure and bubble that will protect people and force people to be good. But don't do your own thing. They were very anti kind of every other religion and belief system out there. So with this, let's look at the kind of the two societies, right? Because I mentioned there's the English, they're both English, but there was significant difference between the two. So you have the Chesapeake Society, and then you have, well, we'll do the Chesapeake first, then we'll do New England. So the Chesapeake, we already looked at, and that's the early English colonization. They came over for land and wealth. Right? And you also had indentured servants. And the reason you had indentured servants was because of cash crops, specifically tobacco, which created a plantation-based farming. And that's important because it's large farms. Right, these are not family farms. These are commercial farms, if you will, and then of course later slaves as well. But the motivation for most of the English coming over, even in Jamestown, was land and wealth. Right, but it creates, because of that, with cash crops, indentured servants, and slaves, and a very different structure of society. New England is where the Puritans end up. Okay, so English as well, but Puritan in structure. And this was with, so this is important too, because there often is confused with two different groups. The very first group of Puritans that went over were actually the Pilgrims. That's the Plymouth group, Story of Thanksgiving, the Mayflowers, from 1620 to 1621. That's not who we're talking about. Here, I'll put them over here. So the first group of Puritans to go to America, right, that was 1620 to 1621, and that's who we call the Pilgrims. And they were a smaller group who really didn't expand. And so the Puritans that we're talking about now, the Puritans we're talking about the Salem witch trials, that's the second group, which was often called the Great Migration. And they were led by John Winthrop in 1630. Okay, so that's where you see, yes, there was a previous group, the Pilgrims. These are not the Pilgrims, and they were There were similarities and differences between the two groups. The Pilgrims essentially kind of just die out. They don't expand, they don't get larger, where you have massive migration and success for a while with the Great Migration with John Winthrop and those Pilgrims. So just to be clear that we're not talking about the Pilgrims here. So John Winthrop they come and they go to New England, and they have a different purpose for going, right? Which was to, practice their own religion. But it goes further than that. They wanted to create that godly society. That was the goal, because this is the idea that it's protective. Just like with John Calvin, it was the belief that they wanted to form a society where religion and politics and society, I guess we should put it all, and the social, or we could put cultural part and culture, were all united uniformly, homogeneously, to the belief of their values and religious values. And we'll see that religion and politics were super intertwined, along with even like how it shaped their culture. And this is where you get then John Winthrop's gave the speech City Upon a Hill. And it was the idea of creating this beacon of society, a town or city that was protected from the evils of the outside world, right? Because they went and tried to do it in Europe, and the outside world came in and influenced their children. So they wanted to go somewhere where they could basically isolate and not have the outside world influence their children and their society and their culture and beliefs, which is why they were so quick to kick people out in the process. And so that was their goal. And this is going to shape the structure of their society. So they leave New England. So they went to Europe, and that didn't work out. Then they decide they're going to leave and go to the Americas. But you have to get a charter from the king. The Virginia Bay Company was the one that got the charter for Jamestown. And so they create their own company to get the charter, which was the Massachusetts Bay Company. And it was entirely for it was entirely for the oh no, I just want to erase. It was entirely for the purpose of going to the New World and getting a charter from the king, because the reality was that they couldn't get it without a charter. I guess they technically could have gone, but they didn't want to risk pissing off the king in the process. Okay, so I wanted to get charter in there first so that we're clear with that. So you have the Massachusetts Bay Company, and that was the charter for that. And so they requested a charter from the king. He gladly gave it to him, of kind of like, please leave, we're happy to not have you here. And their goal was to create not only detach from England, but then set up, like I said, a self-governing colony. And that was what was significant too. As much as the Virginia Bay Company had a charter, they were not detached from England. The Massachusetts Bay Company was essentially allowed to detach from England. And that was largely due to the fact that the king was just sick of them and was happy to see them not come back to England, and instead go somewhere else where he kind of out of sight, out of mind. So what I want to look at before we get into the structure of their town is looking at the passenger list and what that tells us about the two societies. So this was on canvas, and we have the passengers bound for New England, 1634, and passengers bound for Virginia, 1634. So what's interesting with this is that like just the fact that like a ship's manifest can tell you so much about a particular society. So let's look at Virginia first, and because we talked about them already, and then we'll go look at the New England one and compare the difference. So hopefully, as you were looking at this, you notice one of the things that's probably the most obvious that stands out is that the number of women to men is very small, right? Small percentage of women. You have a few, but not that many. The next thing, all right, all these other ones are men. The next thing, hopefully, that you noticed was their age, right? If we just take a look at the various ages, that it's on the younger range of ages, right? We have a couple where you have a 40-year-old and, you know, some 29-year-olds, a 50-year-old, but the reality is that it's very few. Most were in their teens to mid-20s. And so younger age range, mostly men, also single, right? These are individuals. There's a few that look like they're related. I mean, you have Mary Hawks and Ellen Hawks there, but mostly that they're not attached to other people. Well, what this should tell us is that the reality, if we especially if we have some of the background of what the Chesapeake region was, which was the cash crops and farming and land and wealth and that goal, most of these people were probably indentured servants. They were coming over as indentured servants. For the women, it was probably a combination. Actually, well, it was 1634, it was probably tobacco brides. That some could have become indentured servants, but yeah, there's still tobacco brides at this point in time. It's still very early on. And you can see just by the ratio, still very beneficial for women as tobacco brides during this period. Remember, we talked about how women at the beginning, when they're tobacco brides, it actually gave them benefits of subverting femme covert and making favorable marriage contracts. When this ratio in Virginia begins to equal out, then those tobacco brides, it's not such a good deal anymore, and a lot of them end up coming over only to not find a husband and have to become indentured servants. But the fact that they're younger, that you think about like what 14-year-old and 17-year-old has enough money that they're paying for this trip. Remember, passage to the New World was super expensive. This was not a cheap voyage. Most of these people probably had no ability to pay for themselves. And if you have no ability to pay for your voyage yourself, then you're coming as an indentured servant or a tobacco bride. And then the fact that they're younger, that you have mostly single, mostly men, would reinforce that with what the population makeup of Virginia. So just from looking at this passenger list, it gives us these nuggets of seeing, okay, you know, look, single, younger, if they're coming over for landed wealth, they're not paying for their own way. It's unlikely all these people had the money to do so. And that kind of gives you an idea and reinforces what we talked about. So now let's look at the passenger list for New England. And right, the New England, this is the Puritans. So we know New England, that's where the Puritans went. This list looks different. Well, besides being smaller text and stuff, this looks different. And what we know about this is, let's take a look and see, okay, what does it tell us and how is it different? Well, the very first person, Joseph Hull of Somerset, a minister, age 40. So this is interesting because it tells us, just from the first name, that he's older, but it also tells us his job. So the other ones don't have skill sets listed, most likely because, again, of their age, they didn't have a specific profession. Here you have a job. It also is important that the minister is first. It's not a coincidence that the minister is listed first in this list. It didn't just happen to be that way. If we continue down, you have Angus Hull, his wife, his daughter, his son, daughter, and then servants too. And they range in age, right? From, you've got 7 years, 5 years, 3 years. so that they actually came over in families, right? These are set up in families. This whole group right here is one family. And then you have a clothier, 24, his wife, his son. This is a family. You have a few individuals. And then this is a family. Right. Anyways, they go on and on. They break down into families, groups. So the fact that it's families, this should also tell us something else, though. That is a lot of people. And the minister has some of the most. But no matter what, if you're coming over as an entire family unit, that's expensive. They're not coming over as indentured servants. They paid for their passage, right? Which also suggests that the Puritans were more well off. And the fact that they had, they were coming in families, you also had the male to female ratio was even. And that's important for how it structures society for women. But they're also coming over as families already. So you don't have women coming over looking for husbands. You don't have men looking for wives, because they're coming over in family units to begin with. The fact that the minister is listed first would also suggest the importance of religion. And the skill sets, right, the jobs would suggest that you're looking to set up an entire society. The one to Virginia isn't suggesting that at all, right? They're coming into a society to work, right? If we go back to this one, we could put then that this suggests work and labor, right, as the main focus. Yet here, coming over in family units, listing out the specific skilled professions, skilled jobs, suggests a creation of a society rather than for wealth. And the fact that they already have wealth, along with what we know about the terrain in New England, would also suggest that it's not going to be plantations. The soil and region was not conducive for that. And then the fact that they have a whole bunch of money, sure, they could be looking to increase that. And then you might make the logical step of, okay, are they looking for cash crops too? But the fact that if you know the region of New England, that's not conducive for that. So the point of this, right, is the passenger list tells us a lot about the societies. And just from this passenger list, we can begin to see the differences between the Puritans and the English in the Chesapeake region. And they had very different motivations, very different early structures of society, just based on who came over to form that society. Okay, so that's the passenger list. What this tells us then, with the structure of society, we put over there that like they're looking to create a city upon the hill. We'll do Puritan. We'll just say Puritan Society here, and then we'll do early structure. All right. So I mentioned a couple already, but the fact that the geography in New England was not cash crops. They were wealthier. Probably like upper middle class to be able to afford to bring over whole families and stuff. They weren't nobility. They certainly weren't the extremely wealthy. But upper middle class would have been allowed to provide for that, what they were doing, right? They were planning on staying. You don't bring over your whole family and basically a whole community, because that's what you could see with the passenger list. The passenger manifest for the people going to New England, they were already like a pre-made community with the different jobs. And if I didn't point out the jobs, but there were a couple farmers, but a lot of the skilled professions were other things. So they were coming to set up and build an entire community and society. And then the fact that they were coming with their families only reinforces that, right? Women, the significance of when you see women and children in colonization is that people are planning on staying put and creating a society. The other thing with the jobs then was that that if farming, one, geography and no cash crops, and then you add to that the type of jobs that were coming over, the minister being first, religion as important, which it was, and then ultimately that you have skilled labor, and smaller family farms are what they're going to create. So it's not that they didn't do some farming. You had to get food to survive. But that they weren't making these large plantations. And instead, it was broken up into the town, which had a focus on the community and trade. And trade was one of their big ways of making money. And then small family farms. Or we'll put that next to it. Okay, so that's the structure. From right off the bat, then the Puritan Society was different. What I want to look at next is the actual structure of their town, because it was unique and it was set up in a very specific, intentful way. So when we mentioned a couple of these, but that it was broken up by family units, right? And small family farms. And this will be important for when we look at the structure of family a little bit later with that. And then you have trade as an emphasis for making money. The Boston Harbor was a really important economic location, and ports, right? If trade's going to be part of that. And then the towns were meant to be small and visible. So, and in this meaning, the homes were close together. And this is important for several reasons. One, because they did it intentionally. But two, you have a closer sense of community with this than like the Chesapeake region. You'd have hundreds of acres in between neighbors. And so you could go without seeing anyone but your immediate family for days if you wanted to. And it took a lot more to get into town in the Chesapeake region than it did in New England and the Puritan towns. I'm going to sketch out poorly the kind of design of the Puritan town. So we can talk about what was significant with this. So you had two main kind of parts. There's 3 parts total, but there were 2 main areas. So we'll call this first area, this is like the town center. Okay, so here would be, this is where the water is. So you've got the harbor, right? And you would have in this location, you would have in every Puritan town that was created, oops, I was going to write Puritan, you would have a church. Okay, and that would be important. And then you would also have a school, and we'll get into the significance of that because it's very important. And then you had shops. Okay, so this was the town center where you went in to buy stuff for trade, for society. And then you had people's homes. Okay, and so here they set up the homes in a very specific way. You had a walkway essentially. Let's call it a path. It was not like a structured thing. You had the center path, and that was on purpose. And then you had family homes. And so these were big enough, again, they were good size. This may not indicate it. It's not like our suburban homes, okay? It was bigger. And you had the home, and then you had the family farm. So here would be the family farm and the home, and that was replicated on either side. Home, family farm, and so on right over. So these were still good size, especially what we would consider good size today. They weren't tiny plots of land because you had to have a family farm that helped provide for you. But they were closer together compared to the Chesapeake that had miles in between. The third region, and then we'll talk about this, was going to be the country. And this was not part of their original town, but as the Puritan Society and the town grew, more people moved over, right? And then you'd have homes on here. But so we'll put country. And then homes for here. This happened later in time. And you know that because it wasn't part of their original plan. This was always seen as more dangerous and suspicious compared to the rest, because they were more isolated. And not just more isolated, unchecked. Okay, so that this will be important later with the Salem witch trials. Part of the tensions is going to emerge in Puritan societies between the people in the country and the people in the town. And the difference. Usually the people in the country tended to be poorer. What's interesting with Puritan society is most had a similar economic status when they first came. It's going to divide again as more people move in, and poorer was still relative compared to other areas. The Puritans, even with their poor, were better off and more well off than people in the Chesapeake who were poor. So again, somewhat relative what poorer means. They were poorer than the people who lived in the town. They also came later in time, and so then they expanded out into that region, or people began expanding from the country, slowly merging into the town. So why is this important? Well, because this was set up for what the purpose of the towns were. They were responsible for each other. And not only were they responsible for each other, but if you remember that part of Calvinism was the idea of you have to force people to be good. So one of the ways that you force people to be good is to keep people accountable. And you can do that by having everyone be aware of everyone, right? They get to see and know what everyone's doing. It does create a whole gossip structure within Puritan society, and this allows for reinforcing religious structure. So how it does that, right, is that if you notice, the houses face each other, and that's on purpose. You can watch your neighbor watches you. You get to see what each one is doing, and tattle on them if they're doing bad. But it's also like peer pressure. I know my neighbors are watching me, so I got to make sure I behave. The other thing is that this path, the path goes right down the middle of the homes to the town center. Also intentional. And the reason for that was so that everyone knew when you were going to church. On Sundays, when it was church day, people could see who came and who didn't. Again, to hold accountable. It was all set up to pay attention to each other, to keep people accountable. And then you always had, like I said, the church and the structure within the town center where people could hang out and congregate as the kind of central area of government and religion together. Which goes to the next part of the structure of the town, was that the government and the governing body, because of that, was connected to the religious leadership. So the main ministers were often the main political leaders of Puritan society. And how this works out is they had what they called a Bible commonwealth. And they took this from the regular commonwealth. So you had a couple different, there's two normal ones. So the regular commonwealth, and then you had what was called little commonwealth. And one was the structure of government. The other was the structure of your house. So in the regular commonwealth, you had the king, then you had nobility, and this is the hierarchical order of society. Everyone else, so the commoners, and then servants and slaves. Okay, and little commonwealth, it's the father, the mother, sons, then daughters, no matter the age, and then servants. The Puritans did not practice the regular commonwealth. Technically, the Puritans did practice the little commonwealth, but they also then had the Bible commonwealth, right? Which was God, religious leaders, so the ministers, right? And then political leaders, which again often were interchangeable. There were sometimes a political leader that wasn't a religious leader, but these two were often the same. But you put them in because there could be occasional differences. Then you had the visible saints, and we'll talk about them. The visible saints were like the nobility. They didn't have nobility, but they were the next one. And then everyone else. And then servants. Servants, slaves. Now, the Puritans did not have a lot of servants and slaves, but they did have a few. The reason they didn't have a lot of servants and slaves is because they didn't need them for the plantation-based labor. And there was the whole thing about like hard work is good for you and stuff like that. So the Puritans practiced the little commonwealth and the Bible commonwealth. That God is the head of the community, then the religious leaders and political leaders, then the visible saints, then everyone else, and then ultimately the servants and slaves. Okay, and then lastly, within the structure of town, we'll look at education. We could talk about the legal system as well. We'll do education and legal system. We'll put them together. So one of the things, both of these are unique to the Puritans, and that's why I wanted to point them out, is that the Chesapeake area, they didn't have these things really. They had a legal system, but not in the way that the Puritans did, and they did not have a public education system. So what was really beneficial for women in Puritan society and all really Puritan children is that both boys and girls went to school. Right? Every town had a public school, and both boys and girls. Now, if it had just been just boys, it would be impressive that they had a school in every town, but not as impressive as girls. Girls were not publicly educated in this time period. Occasionally, fathers would educate their daughters because they thought that was important, but it was done on an individual basis. Puritan society created public schools which both boys and girls were required to attend. That is a huge deal that girls were required to go to school as well. And then the fact that every town had a school, so just like having a church, every town had a school. And then, the part of the importance of their structure of their town was it was close enough to go to school. One of the things that was difficult for the Chesapeake region is that people were so far out, even if there was a public school, it could be too far to go practically on a regular basis, and that they made everyone go. So why did they make everyone go, and why specifically were girls allowed to go to school and required to go to school? Well, this goes into Puritan, more specifically Protestant belief in the importance of the Bible and reading and interpreting it yourself. One of the things that Martin Luther had set up in his belief and with the Protestant Reformation and Lutheranism that John Calvin and other Protestant branches followed was that you shouldn't rely on the Pope. He argued that part of the reason that the corruption took place in the Catholic Church is because people weren't allowed to or able to read the Bible. And so the monks and friars and anyone that did read the Bible could say it said anything and people wouldn't know any different. And instead, he believed that it was the individual person's responsibility to read the Bible and understand and interpret it. You could have ministers that helped guide you in this interpretation, but they did not have that absolute authority of God like the Pope. Instead, the individual had their own and had to maintain their own responsibility to do so. Well, if that's the case, then girls had to be able to read. Right? If girls were part of the religious structure, which they were, then they had to be able to read. And the schools focused on history. They were topics that were seen as important that you needed to know in order to better understand the Bible. Literature, geography, and languages, right? And these were seen as the essentials for being able to understand the Bible well enough to interpret yourself. The benefit is it created a really good education. The other thing, of course, is that this created a system where all Puritan women were literate, which is huge because the majority of women in early colonial society were not literate. So you ended up having a highly educated structure of society and Puritan society, both for boys and girls and for men and women, but even bigger that all Puritan women were literate and educated, and where the rest of the English colonial society, 5-10% max were literate, let alone having a higher education in that. Now, girls were not allowed to go to the college that the Puritans created later. That was reserved for young boys that were wanting to become ministers and a few other kind of positions. So they definitely did not get the higher ed, but just being able to go to a public school and learn these things and required to do so was a huge step. And Puritan society created highly educated women. And that was definitely a benefit. Now, the legal system was also interesting for women specifically. And so both, I think that's what makes it unique, that it was a school in every town, but then that girls were educated. What made the legal system unique in Puritan society has to do with women as well, in that women could sue both men and women, right, and be sued. Femme covert kind of prevents that. And femme covert, again, it is the structure of when you get married, you fall under femme covert, and your whole identity gets to be your husband's. So you have no legal political identity outside of your husband's. Yet here, even with femme covert, they gave women an identity. Why though? Why did they care that women could sue? Why was that important? Well, that goes to your reputation. In Puritan society, your reputation was everything, and there was a lot of lawsuits against slander. Not surprising, because again, their whole town is set up to spy on everyone. So if you set up your whole town to pay attention to what everyone else is doing, there's going to be gossip. And this can lead to slander then when accusations and gossip spreads, and they're like, oh, did you hear, like, Mary is a witch, which that even before the Salem witch trial, there were women who were accused of being witches. None were convicted, by the way. So there were various levels of how much they believed it or not. They did exile one, but none were ever convicted of. The Puritans required proof, and what they saw as proof, and a rigorous trial. And there's only when the Salem witch trials happened that kind of gets thrown out the window. And so they never reached the level of proof needed to convict someone of being a witch and to execute them. And so at worst, there were a few that were exiled because they were highly suspicious. Most, though, it was dismissed because there was not any evidence to prove it. However, just the accusation of being a witch would mar your reputation. So if you were accused of a witch and then in court was dismissed, or let's say you were accused of being a thief, and you what you could do then is you could sue the person who slandered you. And for women, this was especially important. Their reputation, your reputation dealt with your business prospects. It dealt with your marriage prospects. It dealt with your good name, your religious standing within society. So it was very important. So a woman could then sue the person who she accused of slandering her. If she won in court, right, then she received money and an apology. And then this was seen as clearing your name. Clearing your name was seen as, restoring your reputation. So, but to have that kind of legal precedence for women was also unheard of. Women did not get to go into court and sue, not just women, but especially men in other colonial places in America and Europe even. So in that sense, it gave them a lot of not authority, but certainly some agency to control the narrative that they had. And again, Puritan Society is weird for women because there's some really good benefits for women in Puritan Society, and there are some very negative aspects. Okay, so that's the structure of the town and that system. So next we're going to look at religion. So let's see, was that 2? We did it that way, C. All right, so we're on D here. Religion. What was the structure of their religion? And how did that work? For religion, all right, there are a couple things that we're going to look at. So predestination, right, we already talked about in how that structured the idea of you are either saved or not, and that's already been determined. So the question I brought up was, how do you get people to buy into the religion if technically whatever you do doesn't really matter because it's already been determined one way or another? For the Puritans, they did that with what was called the visible saints, and I mentioned them in the Bible Commonwealth as part of the social order, because it became, again, religion and politics and society all kind of intermingled. So the visible saints were not only kind of like the elite social class of the Puritans, but they often were directly influenced in politics, and then it was directly connected to a religious idea as well. So what the visible saints were, one, they were full church members. So if you reached visible saint status, you became a full church member. There were 2 requirements to be a visible saint. You had to be baptized, and you had to have a conversion experience. And the belief was that how this was connected to predestination, and I'll explain the conversion experience in just a second, was that, right, you can't know for sure. And again, they did emphasize that. We don't know 100%. However, based on how you live your life, would likely be a clue to whether you have been predestined to be saved or not. So the visible saints were seen as the most likely of anyone to be saved. And the way that they kind of classified that then was that they were baptized and they had a conversion experience. A conversion experience was a public declaration of your experience with God. And what the belief was with this was that if you were really likely to be saved, God would bestow upon you an experience. And then you had to publicly get up and present that to the church. Now, women were not allowed to speak in church in Puritan society except for the conversion experience. Then the idea was once you've had your conversion experience, then you became a visible saint. The ideal with this, what the Puritans had hoped, was that all Puritans would be visible saints, right? So that they did, it wasn't like they set out to separate Puritans from visible saints to not. However, the reality, of course, not surprisingly, was much different. One, because it was public, this led to people questioning their conversion experience. And it's not surprising with this, because the Puritans believed that lying was the kind of number one sin. It wasn't sexual sin. It was not, lying was the number one sin. And so if you have these public conversion experiences and someone gets up there and is like, oh man, I had this amazing experience with God. I was just, hanging out in my room, and when all of a sudden this warmth enveloped me to the point that I couldn't move, and I felt God's love, and blah, 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 blah. And then you're like sitting there, you're up next, and you're like, oh, well, my conversion experience was like, I felt God for a second. Now, Puritans didn't believe in direct revelation, so God couldn't speak to you, but you could feel his presence. But it makes sense if lying is the number one sin, and then on top of that, you're listening to other people's public conversion experiences, which, by the way, did get more elaborate with time, naturally, because it was public. And you're supposed to go next, and you hear someone's like amazing one, you probably don't want to get up and then give yours, because even if it was legit, it sounds stupid. But two, they started questioning if theirs was even legitimate. But the requirement for becoming a visible saint is that the conversion experience had to be public. You could not just share it privately. You wanted to become a visible saint, it had to be public. So then what this did is it led to people did not become visible saints because they decided that their conversion experience wasn't real, or they were too embarrassed to go up. Either way, people just started not becoming visible saints. The problem with that is if you're not a visible saint, you can't baptize your kids. And this leads to the second problem, right? If not baptized, right, you can't, no visible saint. You can't become a visible saint. So it created this pattern of not only adults not becoming visible saints, but then their children not being able to become visible saints because they couldn't baptize their children because they hadn't become visible saints. And it created this whole mess and really created a whole separate political social structure of the small elite that were visible saints and the other vast majority of Puritans who were not. it became such a problem that they ultimately had to come up with a solution, which was the halfway covenant. Now, the halfway covenant was created, like I said, in order to address this increasing issue with a lack of visible saints. And the halfway covenant basically just said kids can be baptized even if their parents are not visible saints. And then this was meant to at least provide, I guess, you the decision as an adult whether you were going to become a visible saint, rather than having it be born into it, right? So that became the compromise because it did become such a massive problem of a lack of visible saints within Puritan society. Now, also with religion, technically, their argument was that all people were spiritually equal. Right, so there's a couple things, right? The key being spiritually. They didn't try to argue that women were equal to men spiritually. I mean, outside of spiritually, only in spiritually equal. However, of course, in reality, this didn't play out equally as well. There are parts with it, right, where we did see it is that girls were taught to read the Bible. So that certainly, that belief that all people were spiritually equal benefited women. The other part is that women could be visible saints, right? So that wasn't limited to men. So there are a couple areas where they did practice it, and then that they all expected to have a conversion experience. Where it was not equal, though, is that women were not allowed to talk in church, except for, of course, the conversion experience. So besides that one time, women were expected to remain quiet in church. And they obviously were not part of religious leaders. Women were encouraged to hold Bible studies. And in fact, Puritans were encouraged to question things, question the Bible, question teachings to a degree. You were not supposed to, you could only go so far, but you were encouraged to. If you went too far and then you were told to stop, you were expected to stop. And so that we'll see becomes a problem for Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams in the process. However, women could not teach men, right? So they could have a Bible study, but it could only be with other women. Teach men. They were not supposed to. Cannot write this word today. They were not supposed to teach men. It was only supposed to be women getting together, right? So you can't talk in church, but go ahead, women, you can get into your own group and you may talk about stuff there if you want. And then lastly, with that, Sundays. So one of the misconceptions about Puritans was that they were stuffy and never had any fun and all of that. And the reality is that that's not true at all. They wore colors. It's not, I guess, bright. It's what you could make and produce with dyes in the area. But they wore colored clothing. They didn't wear black and white like the Pilgrims. Again, here's the misconception of merging Pilgrims in with the rest of the Puritans. They were different. They encouraged affection. We'll see that in a minute when we talk about family, that premarital sex was not super taboo. It was kind of expected that it would happen. So they danced, they played games. They were not this up and stuffy peoples, except for on Sunday. Sunday, everyone was expected to go to church. And it was noted if you did not. And while this initially is not necessarily a problem as the Puritan community grows, there were people who weren't really that much of an ardent believers, and it created problems for them in the society, right? And the issue is not everyone expected to go to church, but the whole town structure was set up to watch you, to make sure you walked your butt down to go to church. And then everyone knew who didn't, and then you got penalized for that. And there were consequences, both what you could argue socially and economically. So we'll say consequences both socially and economically if you did not go. To the point where you could be exiled if you persisted in not going to church. The other thing was Sundays were deemed days that were no work or play. So it was supposed to be a day for God. So where you could definitely say, oh, Puritans were stuffy, could be on Sundays. That was the only day where they had these type of rules. It was supposed to be a day of rest, right? And a day for God. And there were punishments and fines if you broke this. And a repeat offender, again, could be exiled. So there's some of those examples of how they like to exile everyone. And I think that's where you get a lot of the negative, that view of Puritans were no fun, they didn't do anything, is it was a mix of mixing the pilgrims and then Sunday rules and restrictions to get that. All right, family life. Marriage played a central role, well, in colonial society altogether, because it was fundamental for prospering and continuing your population. But in Puritan society, it was even more so. They saw it as the foundation for society. And this was, and then you had like responsibilities or obligations to raise up godly children and productive children, I suppose, too. But there was an emphasis on that family and marriage was important for survival. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. One has to do with the fact that you had a family farm. They don't have large plantations with indentured servants. Your trade or business, if and just day-to-day chores, that all of this requires both as partners, right? So husband and wife have to work together in order to thrive. And it was the ideal role for women. It was really the only role. We'll say ideal role, but widows really didn't have a place in Puritan society. And so it was the ideal role for women. This is what they were supposed to do, get married and have children. But it was interesting because they did emphasize this idea of working together as partners. And that was essential for success, and it really was, because if you had the wife that didn't help with the children and the house and the farm, colonial life is hard. There is a lot of work to do, and it was necessary for both participants to work together to survive and to raise up their children. The other thing is that married couples were encouraged to be affectionate and full of love. In fact, you had John Winthrop that talks about how that you should, and married couples show affection and love for each other, and sex was encouraged in marriage and really just overlooked in outside of it. Right? So they weren't this, like, again, stuffy people who didn't ever want to, don't touch, don't show emotion, that type of thing. That gets us into premarital sex. And again, this is, I think, one where people are surprised with the Puritan attitude on premarital sex. First, they basically just ignored it. It was expected. However, if you got pregnant from that, you were expected to marry the person. Right? And then, of course, adultery was a big no-no. That was frowned upon. And women were punished harder. This is in any part of society. Women were punished more harshly than men for adultery, but both were punished. They really looked down upon this. But it is, I think, important to mention, in some societies, men were not punished for adultery, and men were punished as well, just not as strictly as women. The belief was that the importance was, like I said, that really that you got married, and they actually had a belief that, like, at the height of labor, as the baby was coming out, that was a period when women couldn't lie. So if you got pregnant and you weren't married and you didn't say who the father was, or there was an objection, someone saying they weren't the father, at the height of giving birth, the midwife would ask, who's the father? And then whoever the woman said was taken as the truth, because the belief that she couldn't lie in the height of childbirth. And whoever she named, that man would be legally bound to be the father and to marry her, which could give women a lot of power on that. So there was, society, like, essentially made you get married. You didn't really have a choice to be a single mother. Besides that, you do have divorce and widows. And this, the first thing is that divorce was allowed, which was also unique, and that women could initiate divorce. This was discouraged, but it was allowed. And I think, like I said, more importantly, the fact that women could choose to get divorced. They could petition to get divorced. There were still rules and stipulation, and for most women, it wouldn't make sense to get divorced because of the next part, which is that widows were seen as dangerous, and dangerous is probably the best word for that. There were a lot of rules for widows, right? Remember, we looked at the Chesapeake area. To be a widow was actually beneficial. You could end up becoming wealthy and having femme sole and a lot of autonomy. In Puritan society, that's not the case. Widows were seen as dangerous. Any lack of male authority was bad. And so consequently, again, this is why a woman would want to get divorced, because, we should put that right, remarriage, second marriage was rarely allowed. Second marriage is were rare. So it's not like you could be like, well, I'm going to get divorced and then I'm going to get married to this other person. Instead, he became a widow. But widows were seen as dangerous. Any lack of male authority was bad. Widows, for at least a year, and often more, had to live with a visible saint family. And the reason for this was that the visible saint family was seen as more religious and appropriate, right? They're the good religious one. And of course, being a family, then there was a male. The key with this is that there was a male authority, right? This massive fear that women without male authority in Puritan society were somehow going to go crazy. And this will play into the Salem witch trials as well. Led to this serious concern that you needed to have women with a male authority at all times. That was ultimately their role, and that to lose that was just a ticking time bomb, essentially, for that. So the widows had to, at least for a year, often longer, live with a visible saint family, and they rarely had any economic freedom. Right? There was not a lot of benefits to being a widow. So why is this, if we look at, I think, John Winthrop's speech, this is in Voices for Freedom as well. This is just part of it, but I just put it on here because it's easier to show. So this is talking about types of liberty. And there's two types of liberty. Concerning liberty, I observe a great mistake in the country about that. There is a twofold liberty. Natural, I mean, as our nature is now corrupt, or civil or federal, which he also calls moral. So you have natural liberty, and then the other one has three names. We'll just stick with moral liberty, but he also calls it civil or federal. The first is common to man with beasts and other creatures. By this man hath liberty to do what he lists, which is do what he wants. So if we're looking at these, right, natural liberty then is to do what you want. And more importantly is the next part of it, and it can be good or bad. Right? So natural liberty isn't inherently just bad. The first is a liberty to do evil as well as good. So, right, it can be good or bad. The other part with that it says is that this liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority and cannot endure the least restraint of the most just authority. And the exercise and maintaining of this liberty makes men grow more evil. So while it is the liberty to do what you want, and it can be good or bad, it eventually becomes evil. And more specifically, this will be important when we talk about Anne Hutchinson and dissidents. It is against authority, which the Puritans are going to see as bad. So then the next one is moral authority, right? The other kind of liberty I call civil or federal. It may be also termed moral. This liberty is the proper end and object of authority. So it is for or with authority, and cannot subsist without it. It is a liberty to that only which is good, just, and honest. So it's good, just, and honest, right? So this moral liberty is ultimately the liberty they want, right? Technically, natural liberty can be good, but inevitably, because it's against authority, it eventually becomes evil. That's his argument. But moral liberty is good, just, and honest because it not only supports authority, he's saying it cannot subsist without it. So it's saying it cannot live without it. It has to have authority. This liberty is maintained and exercised in a way of subjection to authority. right? So that's important as well. Subjection to authority. The Puritans definitely saw that. It is the same kind of liberty wherewith Christ have made us free. Now here they gives an example in terms of women, which again, we're talking about the positives and negatives of women in Puritan society. Here shows you a negative of the view of women within it. The woman's own choice makes a man her husband, yet being so chosen, he is her lord, and she is to be subject to him, yet in a way of liberty, not of bondage. And a true wife accounts her subjection to her honor, in her subjection, her honor and freedom, and would not think her condition safe and free, but in her subjection to her husband's authority. Such is the liberty of the church under the authority of Christ. So this is the idea of, they're comparing it to the idea, right? Moral liberty is the liberty to choose to be subject to authority. And then he says, just like women choose to be under the subject of the authority of their husband, and they don't see that as a slavery, right? Or having it be limiting. Instead, it's you gain honor and freedom through being subjected to the authority of your husband. But that shows you the expectation of where women are within it. Puritan society was a very patriarchal society and had a very strict hierarchical structure. It's why God is first, and then the priest and ministers are second, and everyone in society is expected to obey and fall in line with the authority of the ministers and the leaders. Likewise, women are expected to fall in line with the authority of their husbands. So if we go back to the widows, right? The idea is, why are they seen dangerous? Why are they not given any type of freedom? Because they are essentially no longer following a part of moral authority, when not necessarily by choice, but just simply they're no longer following the natural moral authority. And they're given, the fear is that they would revert back to, or they would revert to natural liberty, without the husband being the authority figure in their lives. So that's why that moral, right here, we'll put here that moral liberty was followed through marriage. Okay. And the fear was, it wasn't like it was like a guaranteed thing, but the fear of widows kind of connected to, and we'll see this with Anne Hutchinson following moral versus natural liberties, is that they would revert to natural liberty without authority of a male presence. That's why they made them, where was it? Here we go. Live with at least a year with a family to prevent natural liberty from coming back. It's interesting because it's logic wise it's weird, but that was their view, and we'll see moral and natural liberty come back up when we talk about Anne Hutchinson. Okay, and then for family still, children is the last thing that we're going to talk about with family, and then we'll look at Anne Hutchinson. So children, right, the goal of parents was to raise godly children. That was their first priority, not just raise them, but raise godly children, and also to become productive citizens. And that one makes sense because you really needed citizens to work to function, to survive, for survival. There were no arranged marriages. So that was something that's common in the colonial world, but here, no, you didn't have arranged marriages. If a guy liked a girl and they decided they wanted to get married, a proposal would be presented to the parents. Yeah, well, and usually that's specifically, right, the girl's parents. because ideally the boy had already talked with his parents. Usually they agreed. Like, it wasn't like then they were very picky and said no until the guy they wanted shows up. Usually they agreed. And then the parents' job was to help set up the kids' first home. And both worked together, right? For the future husband, he usually provided the land, but then the land, livestock, and household goods, right? These were seen as partially parents' responsibility. So it was seen as like this handoff where you work to, transition your child into adulthood through marriage. One of the things that was, I think, important to mention about kids, because this will come back with the Salem witch trials, is that you do have one group, young teenage girls, who were probably the least important group besides servants. Okay, so they were the most marginalized group, because if you remember at the Bible Commonwealth or the Little Commonwealth, girls are daughters, no matter what, are under boys. And why they were the most marginalized group, versus just saying, well, because they were girls, there's a reason to it, is that the ideal role of women was to be a wife and mother. So you have like 3 phases, essentially, right? As a young child, children were seen as precious. And so you got more attention because you needed it, right? And you were doted on and that type of thing. And then you have teenage years, and then marriage years. Let's say when you're old enough to get married, but maybe are not. This was your role, so that was seen thus as important. But in this weird phase here, no role or attention. It's like, as a girl, you hit in teenage years this completely marginalized role where you were one of the least important people in society. Until you hit the age where then you could fulfill your role. But if you were young enough, then that role hadn't kicked in yet, and you were young enough to be seen as important as a child and doted on. But as a teenager, you were like, well, you're not a kid anymore, but you're not quite there for marriageable age. And so this we're going to come back to when we look at how teenage girls played a role in the Salem witch trials. It's not surprising, because it's kind of like they were rudderless, because you didn't have a defined role for that period of time. Young child, your role was to be a young child. Marriageable age, your role was to find a husband and become a wife and mother. Teenagers, you didn't have that. And so all of a sudden we'll see these teenage girls get thrust into the spotlight and get more attention than they've ever had before. Why is that? Well, because there was this concern about witchcraft, but it's not surprising then that the girls kind of went with it for a while. They were the most marginalized group in Puritan society, and now the entire town thought what they said was important. And then when it got to a point where they started questioning, they were too far in. And so then they went with it. So we'll talk about that more with the Salem witch trials, but it is an important component of it. All right, now the last thing I want to look at is kind of protest and stuff that way, dissidents, if you will, those who push back, right? And there are 2 main ones we're going to look at. So Anne Hutchinson we'll look at first, and then I'm just going to briefly mention Roger Williams. So we're mostly going to talk about Anne Hutchinson, but it is important to note that there were plenty of people who did get kicked out. Both her and Roger Williams end up being exiled. So Anne Hutchinson, she just had more against her because she was a woman. Roger Williams definitely got more chances before he was exiled. Anne Hutchinson got a few, but Roger Williams got several. So she, right off the bat, she and her husband moved to the area, and she was a very, very smart woman, and she started having Bible studies. And she had popular Bible studies that both men and women attended. So there were two things that became problems here. Hopefully you picked up on one right away, right? We'll say problems. One, men attended. Women were not supposed to teach men. And she was so popular that apparently at one point more people went to her Bible study than to church. And not surprisingly, the pastors, the ministers didn't like that. And she also was within the popular, we'll put problem here too, she challenged some of the ministers' teachings. So not only did she, kind of break the rules of that, she was directly challenging the minister. She also put up a big fight about the conversion experience. And her argument was that it shouldn't be public, that it was a private experience, and therefore should be a private discussion. What she wanted to do was have you would share it with the minister privately, but you wouldn't get up in front of the church and say it. And so she ends up being brought to trial. And charged, we're going to look at the charges, basically she's brought to trial for being a disorderly woman, if you will, for challenging she's brought for not following moral liberty, right, which would follow authority. Because what happened is that she was asked to stop the Bible study, and she didn't. So it was bad enough that she was challenging the church authority, which they would have seen as natural liberty, right? But then she was a woman having a Bible study and challenging the church authority was just even worse. So I want to write the list of things that she's charged with. Let's look at this transcript. Again, this is in Voices of Freedom, but we're going to look at it here so I can mark it up and you can see it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's long. I'm going to read some key excerpts from it. Anne Hutchinson is super smart. She's winning the entire time, and it's only at the very end that she loses, and it's not from the argument that they originally brought her. I don't even think that what she ended up being charged with heresy, right? Which is like being against the doctrine of the church, things that are illegal in the church beliefs. And the belief was a direct revelation. Remember, I mentioned before, Puritans didn't believe that God spoke directly to them. In fact, it was a big no-no in Puritan society. God didn't speak directly to people anymore. That was a thing of the Old and New Testament. You could experience God's presence, but God did not speak to people anymore. And so she's going to be charged with heresy for proclaiming that she had a direct revelation from God. But that's not why they brought her in. They didn't know about that at the time. They brought her in because she was a woman who was holding a Bible study that was teaching to both men and women and was more popular than church at times, and that she was directly challenging the minister and really the visible saints and their power. So she was challenging the kind of whole social structure of Puritan society, and then she refused to stop, which was the other part of it. They only end up charging her with heresy because it comes up at the end. This entire trial, she's winning. Until the very end with the whole direct revelation, she is totally winning. But she's very smart. So we're going to look at a couple points there, and then the direct revelation, you'll see how they respond to her changes because they know they've won. So here, this first paragraph, and it's the first paragraph in Voices of Freedom 2. It's really important because this lists a ton of the things they're claiming they have problems with. Miss Hutchinson, you are called here as one of those that have troubled the peace of the Commonwealth and the churches here. So there's the first charge, if you will. You are known to be a woman. Again, the importance that they emphasize several times that she's a woman doing this, it clearly is part of the problem. We'll put 2 just for that, right? That have had a great share in the promoting and divulging of these opinions that are the cause of this trouble, right? But most importantly, that she's a woman doing this, and to be nearly joined not only in affinity and affection with some of those that the court have taken notice of and passed censure upon. So she's hanging out with the ruffians. Essentially, you're hanging out with those we've already censured for having bad ideas and thoughts. But you have spoken diverse things, as we have been informed, very prejudicial to the honor of the churches and the ministers. So you're speaking negative about the churches and the ministers. And you have maintained a meeting and an assembly in your house that have been condemned by the General Assembly as a thing not tolerable, no comely in the sight of God, nor fitting for your sex. So that's her Bible studies. Meeting an assembly in your house that has been condemned by the General Assembly. This is an important part of it too. They're saying we already condemned this and you kept doing it. And notwithstanding that was cried down, you have continued the same, right? There they directly say it. Therefore, we have thought good to send for you to understand how things are, and if you be in an erroneous way, we may reduce you so that you may become a profitable member here among us, right? The importance of what you were supposed to raise your children to be. Otherwise, if you be obstinate in your course, that then the court may take such course that you may trouble us no further. That means exile. Therefore, I would entreat you to express whether you do assent and hold in practice to these opinions and factions that have been handled in court already. That is to say, whether you do not justify Mr. Wheelwright's sermon and the petition. So then they're saying, okay, so here are all the different problems we have with you. We brought you here today to see if we can correct that action and you can become a profitable member of society, or if we're going to have to exile you. And then they're basically like, so what do you say? Miss Hutchinson, I am called here to answer before you, but I hear no things laid to my charge. So he just went and listed all this stuff, and she's like, yeah, what's the charge? Because technically none of those things they listed were illegal against the law. They were just things you didn't do in Puritan society. I have told you some. So then Miss Winthrop, I have told you some already, and more I can tell you. Name one, sir. Have I not named one already? What have I said or done? Why, for your doings, this you did harbor and countenance those that are parties of this faction that you've heard of. So she's basically like, yeah, name one charge. So the one that Winthrop comes up with is hanging out with the bad people that have already been censured. And she says that's a matter of conscience. And then they go on for this for a while. And she keeps asking him, what's the charge? What law do they transgress? So she's like, just name a freaking specific law I've broken. And he's like, the law of God and state. What in particular? Why, in this among the rest, whereas the Lord doth say, honor thy father and mother. And then if you broke the law, what law have I broken? Why, the 5th commandment, right? Which is the father and mother. So that's what, 6? I guess I made that 6, so 7. So this one, the one comes a little bit later that they also tack in. And it really only comes later because she keeps being like, name a freaking specific law, dude. And if you can't name a law, then why am I here? So finally it's like, the 5th commandment. And they're like, honor thy father and mother. And she argues that, like, where is that a problem? What's the breach of law? Why dishonoring the Commonwealth, Mrs. Hutchinson? So this is important. They're saying, right, the Commonwealth, this goes back to the Bible Commonwealth and that order and moral liberty. The expectation that you follow the authority of godly people and those in place of that. And the Bible Commonwealth puts God and then priests and ministers above everyone else in Puritan society. And so she was not following that. And that's how he puts it out, though, because he had to come up on the fly with a specific law because they didn't have one. They just had a bunch of accusations of, here's our problem with you. And then when she kept pressing and saying, yeah, go ahead and freaking name one, that's what he came up with. And then she argues really successfully against this. And it goes on and on like that for a while of like, go ahead and name it. What do you mean that? How does that work? Well, that's a matter of conscience, and I think that's not true. Why don't you tell me specifically? And they get really frustrated with her. I pray, sir, prove it that I said they preached nothing but a covenant of works. So this was actually one of the things that they claimed that she was being inappropriate or talking disparagingly against the minister. And what they argued was that she was claiming he only preached a covenant of works, which is not with Protestant belief system. Puritan, Lutheranism, Calvinism, it doesn't matter. It was not the Protestant belief system. Protestant belief system under that Martin Luther started, that all of these other groups followed, was that good works does not make you saved. And he argued that the Catholic Church, Martin Luther, that the Catholic Church was emphasizing good works towards salvation. And so it was a big part of Protestant belief that works alone do not save. It's by the grace of God that people are saved, and only by the grace of God. And so they're arguing, look, you're trying to claim that the minister was preaching good works. And then she says, prove it. Nothing but a covenant of works, right? Did I ever say they preached a covenant of works then? If they do not preach a covenant of grace, clearly then they preach a covenant of works. No, sir, one may preach a covenant of grace more clearly than another, so I said. So again, if you just read through this, you should be struck by how much Anne Hutchinson owns the rest of the Puritans until the very end. So let's skip to that because I want to, this one goes longer than the excerpt in Voices of Freedom. So I'm just trying to skip what's not in Voices of Freedom. The very end, if we get to here, all right, here we go. So she's been owning him this entire time, and then she ends up sharing this longer one with how did she know it to be true with what she was preaching with her Bible studies. And while she's explaining how she knows that she's right, she ends up saying that the voices were spoken to her. And then I feel like the instant she said that, all the judges who have been beaten down all this time sit up and are like, aha! And they say, how did you know it was the Spirit? How did Abraham know it was God that bid him offer his son, being a breach of the sixth commandment? By an immediate voice. So to me, by an immediate voice. Now look at this. How? An immediate revelation? They're like, yes, we finally got her! Because they didn't like her. They didn't like women pushing back this much. Again, you could question, you could challenge to agree, but under the concept of moral liberty, and Bible Commonwealth, when the church leaders, or potentially visible saints, but especially the church leaders and ministers, told you to stop, you were expected to stop. And she didn't. And not only did she not, but she was owning them. And they hated that because, again, they emphasized several times, it was also because she was a woman doing this. And this was not becoming of her sex and what she was supposed to do. So, we got her. Like, it's immediate. Like, how? Yes, like, how? This is totally like a celebration. Yay! We got her finally. It only took like, an hour trial or longer than that, probably, for how long the transcript is. An immediate revelation. And then she continues with that, explaining it. And then he said, behold, I turn away from you. And it kind of goes on, and I am persuaded that the revelation she brings forth is delusion. All the court, but some 2 or 3 ministers, cry out, we all believe it, we all believe it. The court hath already declared themselves satisfied concerning the things you hear, and concerning the troublesomeness of her spirit, and the danger of her course amongst us, which is not to be suffered. Therefore it be the mind of the court that Miss Hutchinson, for these things that appear before us, is unfit for our society, and if it be the mind of the court that she shall be banished out of our liberties and imprisoned till she be sent away, let them hold up their hands. All but 3 did so. Miss Hutchinson, the sentence of the court you hear is that you are banished from out of our jurisdiction as being a woman, again, a woman not fit for our society, and are to be imprisoned till the court shall send you away. I desire to know wherefore I am to be banished. Say no more. The court knows wherefore and is satisfied. So then, if you look at, there's also a change in how they respond to her once they know they have her, right? Because they're kind of muddling through their responses to her all the way up until this point. But then you have this shift when she says immediate revelation, and how they respond to her, and then it dismisses her. Oh, it's a delusion, and she is obviously clearly mental, and we're not going to have a woman like that in our society. And they exile her, which she ends up dying not that much longer. I think they go to New York. But then her and her husband end up dying in an Indian attack that takes place, and they're killed. Unfortunately for her, she didn't live too much longer after this. I think it was a couple of years, maybe 2, and then she ends up dying and stuff. But there's several things with this that's important. So I want to look at first. We'll write down they're not all charges, but the issues they have with her, because I think they're important, because it tells you a lot of what's going on. So we'll say charges here, right? And one is trouble, that she caused trouble in the Commonwealth. Let's see, what's the troubled the peace of the Commonwealth. Right, so that was the first thing that they said what was an issue. And then the next was a woman who has promoted these opinions. So just the fact that it's a woman troubling the peace is problematic for him. Then if we go to the next one, right, that she's hanging out with, I'm just going to say hanging out with bad people. Hanging out with the troublemakers. And those were seen as people who had already challenged or pushed back or done something bad with the Puritan community, and they'd been censured, is what he called it. So they'd already been censured, slap on the wrist, and she's hanging out with these people. So that's a bad note. Then spoke diverse things, basically that she spoke poorly, poorly, let's say maybe negatively is a better word for that, against the minister. Right, which then they link to causing problems in society. So that's important. It's connected to the idea that in her speaking out against the minister, she's causing problems in there. You know, our society was fantastic until you started speaking up, kind of thing. And then her Bible study. And there's two things with this, right? The first is that it was that she was teaching men, and that they had asked her to stop. Right? Again, she wouldn't have been condemned if she'd had a Bible study. She probably would have gotten a slap on the wrist for teaching men. But if she'd stopped when they asked, that would be okay, because they did encourage some challenge to the system. That's this weird dichotomy with Puritan society. And then her behavior, not appropriate. Maybe we put the exact wording here with that. Not comely in the sight of God. Right, so she's not acting appropriate as a woman for a woman. And so that, it's important, right? That wouldn't have been on there if it was a man at all. And then she continued to ignore them, continued to ignore their authority. And that gets to the idea of, with the other one too, with the fifth commandment. So then lastly, broke the fifth commandment. But of course, what they mean with the fifth commandment, for the religious commandment, right, was the moral liberty. That what they called the fathers of the Commonwealth. So not that she disobeyed her actual parents, but that they're within the fifth commandment, they're saying the Commonwealth, the ministers, they're the parents in that situation. Right? Now, what's significant besides the fact that what's that? Trial. So we'll put 4 here. We'll say consequences, right? She was exiled and later died in an attack by Native Americans, right? So that, I mean, that was a consequence because she died probably sooner than if she'd stayed in the Puritan Society. But there was a greater consequence with what happened afterwards. Okay, so women, after she was exiled, we see a massive uptick in other Puritan women who went to court and challenged various laws and systems. So what's interesting is she seems to have had an impact on women to speak up and stand up against certain aspects of Puritan society. Women were also, after her exile, were charged more frequently, more often, than they had been before Anne Hutchinson with disorderly behavior. Now with this one, there's 2 things that could be happening. The first is the question, was Puritan leaders, so were Puritan leaders harsher against women that were challenging them after Anne Hutchinson? So was this uptick in charges just because Puritan leaders were harsher against women? Right, women after Anne Hutchinson. Okay, so because it could be that. if you see that more women are being charged with disorderly behavior after Anne Hutchinson was banished, maybe it was just a fear of, as more women started to come forward and put charge the various laws and systems, that they reacted going, we don't want another Anne Hutchinson, and so they started charging them more. Or did more women challenge the system? Right, we know they did in one part because they were going to court and challenging it that way. But in the sense of, if more people were charged with disorderly behavior, right, does that mean more and more women were bucking the system, not just challenging in court, but pressing more and more against that, right? So it could be a little bit of both. It probably was a little bit of both. One of the other consequences, besides the fact of that you have more women challenging that, is that shortly after her exile, they made conversion experiences private. It's almost like a punch in the gut there with that, right? They're like, oh, we don't like you, but we like your we actually think conversion experiences should be private. We agree with you. We just weren't going to do it while you were here. So she had a big impact on Puritan society, and some would argue that she also had an impact on the Salem witch trials, even though she wasn't around by that point. That because more women were challenging, because more women were speaking out, the Salem witch trials and the hysteria at charging and executing women was almost like a subconscious response to pushing back against these women challenging the system. And then just Roger Williams, he challenged the system too, and the church leaders. Roger Williams, again, because I'm not going to talk about him, it's already going a little bit longer than I wanted. I'll just put his name, and I would recommend the Invoices of Freedom. You can read about him. It's also in Give Me Liberty. So they do talk about him. Roger Williams, what he challenged was that he protested land grabs from Native Americans. And he condemned the church leaders for their actions and was very negative and public against church leaders. Right, so he did stand up to the authorities and to the Puritans as well. And not surprisingly, like, he eventually is exiled. He actually founds Rhode Island and sets up Rhode Island as one of tolerance, religious tolerance. It has one of the more liberal laws. And that is direct, even to this day, like, Rhode Island was shaped by Roger Williams. So he was an important person. But we're out of time. So that's where we'll leave it. We're going to pick up with the Salem witch trials next and kind of think about moral authority, and how the role of girls and women that we talked about, and how that's going to come into play along with the structure of the town in the Salem witch trials.